Hello everyone, welcome back to another Grim Dawn video. This is going to be talking about the constellations, aka the devotion point usage that I generally approach Blademaster with. In the previous episode, we talked about the skills that I use for generalized builds. These are builds that I like to kind of improv as I go through. If I don't know specifically what build I want to go for, I generally improv, and frankly, improv is my favorite way to play, so a lot of my gameplay revolves around being able to switch between different playstyles. Well, we'll be talking about devotions for this, and as I mentioned in the previous video, some of your skill choices are going to be a little dependent on your constellations, and if you approach the constellations wrong, it can get a bit painy to reverse them, right? It's a little easier doing, undoing skills, although it can still be quite expensive from an Iron Bits perspective, but for constellations, for devotion points, you also need aether crystals, which can be way more expensive if you don't already have a built-up stash of these, right? So it's pretty important that you approach the devotion points for the Blademaster very, very carefully, okay? Now, I'm going to be referencing the previous video. Obviously, this is a follow-up to the previous video. We're also going to be going in roughly the same order that I approached builds in that video. So, for instance, I will be starting off with talking about the poison cold build, right? Again, the big problem, really, not really so much the point, but the big problem with Blademaster is that some skills of the soldier clash with the Nightblade skills due to requiring specific equipment, specifically weaponry. So when you approach constellations for Blademaster, you want to get sort of your necessities down first, alright, before you start extrapolating out to a bit more specific constellations, and the cold poison is a great example of how you generally want to be approaching this, as well as a great example of what the consequences are if you do this wrong, if you approach this incorrectly. Alright, so for the cold poison, we know right off the top, obviously, we need Murmur, right? We're actually going to zoom in here. There we go. And there we go, now we can read. So you definitely want Murmur first, right? Because you want this cold poison resistance, right? You want this. This is 6 green, 6 blue, 3 red, right? Now, the blue is easiest. We're going to get the blue first because, quite honestly, that's really easy to get. You put in the point in crossroads, and I don't normally advocate specifically for leaving a single point in blue crossroads, but early on in the game, the 18 defensive ability is going to help you, but now comes the question, what constellation do I recommend for 5 blue? Because obviously we have two options here, Sailor's Guide and the Eel right off the top. You could go Tsunami. If you really want to go heavy into the cold damage, you can, but keep in mind that that electric damage, the lightning damage, isn't really going to be doing a whole lot for you, alright? So I don't usually go into Tsunami. It's worth mentioning really quick here that you could if you really wanted to, but just be aware of the fact that this is very specifically for the cold damage, but this is an option if you really want it, but I usually go for the Eel. There are a couple of reasons I specifically go for the Eel. First off, it's only 3 devotion points for 5 blue. Second off, if I do decide later on that I'm going to dual wield and I want Shadow Dance, the 2% chance to avoid melee and projectiles is going to stack quite nicely with your Shadow Dance, and if you max Shadow Dance, you're looking at 12% dodge. I believe it's 12% dodge right off the top. It's actually more, I think. It winds up being a total of, 24, so you're actually dodging. I cut it in half because apparently I'm having a brain cramp. So you're looking at a total of 26 dodge, which is actually over a quarter, barely, but still roughly a quarter of the incoming attacks are going to be dodged, which is absolutely great. So if I decide later on that I want to go for Shadow Dance, I can, but even if I don't, the Eel still gives you some decent stat increases. You can see a good amount of defensive ability and some move speed, some pierce. I recommend Sailor's Guide only specifically for either modded games or hardcore. And the primary reason why is this reduced freeze duration right here and the reduced, the increase in slow resistance. This is really big in hardcore. Again, one of my #1 causes of death in hardcore is getting stunned or trapped or something in some kind of AoE damage while other enemies are attacking me and killing me. And this also can apply to any mod that increases enemy stats. Very similar situations often happen to me there. So you do have this, potential issue. So for any mod that increases enemies' stats, specifically their damage, and hardcore, of course, Sailor's Guide is going to be worth the extra point in a lot of those situations. For this example, we'll be using the eel. Alright, but just keep in mind, Sailor's Guide does have its uses. Okay? So we have our blue done and out of the way. That's not an issue at all anymore. Now we have to get our red and green. Now, we are going with poison, right? So I usually like to go for the rat first. So we get the red crossroads and we go ahead and grab our rat, and then I usually get the scorpion. Now you might be wondering, Professor, why not get the scorpion first, right? You have all of this poison damage. You get technically more poison damage. You get some here, you get some physique, you get acid damage here, you get increased poison duration, and you have scorpion sting, which incidentally, I'll talk about this in a bit, but I usually assign to Blade Burst, Amarasta's Blade Burst. I'll talk about that in a second, but let's return to the rat. The reason why I get the rat first is very specifically because the rat gives some green right off the top, and this gives me immediate access to Acheron's Scorpion without having to go back and do things. If I did this in reverse, if I got one green crossroads, I wouldn't be able to get the rat, and since the Scorpion doesn't give you one red, you have to go back, you have to pull out the one green in crossroads, or just leave that there and then go for the red in crossroads anyways, still get the rat. It's a pain, right? It's a slightly more inefficient way of doing it. So I go rat first, and then I go into the scorpion. And this is going to, as you can see, give us access to Murmur, which is just absolutely fantastic. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, I put this Scorpion Sting on Amarasta's Blade Burst because, as I mentioned in the previous episode, Amarasta's Blade Burst is a skill you always want in this build approach. It doesn't matter what weapon you're using, Amarasta's Blade Burst is going to be effective. Same thing with Scorpion's Sting. No matter what weapon you're using, this is going to be very effective. It only has 40% weapon scaling, which matters somewhat. It allows it to at least scale into the late game with you fairly effectively. It's more about maintaining consistent poison damage throughout the fight, and it's very useful for that. But regardless, this being on Amarasta's Blade Burst ensures that no matter how you decide to rework your weaponry, you'll always have this. You will never need to pull out the Scorpion, you'll never need to fiddle around with the Scorpion at all, you've just always got this, okay? Just makes life so much easier for you, right? For Murmur, for specifically her Rumor ability, again, I usually go with Ring of Steel. Again, I talked in the previous episode about the Ring of Frost enhancement. This is why I usually like to slap the Rumor on that, right? You're hitting a whole bunch of people, you have 15% chance per hit, so if you're surrounded, you're likely to hit one of them, right? And it spreads kind of like the Plague ability, actually pretty similarly to the Plague ability from the Occultist. So that's kind of how it works. So this is very effective, especially in mods that increase enemy group numbers. Very effective there, right? So now we have Murmur. So this is kind of our baseline. These are the constellations you're always going to want. Again, which one of the two blues you choose is going to depend on your context. But we have everything we really need. That these aren't going to be adjusted, right? These constellations, we don't need to adjust. We don't need to change any of these. These will be consistently effective regardless of what weapons we're using. But now we want to get to Ugol, because Ugol gives us cold and poison damage increases, right? We have some also really nice resistance increases here, including reduced petrify, which is really nice for hardcore. We have cold damage here, right? And we've got some attack damage conversion. We've got life leech resistance, which actually makes this particular build, by the way, the cold poison Blademaster. If I'm choosing to go after some of the secret bosses, I use the term secret loosely, this is one of my favorite builds to use because they can be built very easily into dealing very high damage to bosses, and with the life leech resistance here, as well as the reflected damage reduction here, the cold poison Blademaster can be very effective at dealing with heroes and bosses, and Yugol is a big reason why I like using Blademasters for that reason. Whether I'm dual wielding, using a two-hand weapon, it doesn't make a difference, right? It's just going to be consistently effective. I don't necessarily always go for Black Blood. It is worth mentioning really quick here. We're also having some kind of weird issue. There we go. I probably was too close to the border there. I don't always go for this. This can be nice. You can see where the Black Bloods have flat damage. They don't increase with you, although they do reduce enemy damage. So this is more of a personal preference thing. If you want the Black Blood, you can absolutely go for it. I don't always go for this. I'm actually more likely to go actually put the point in this if I'm running a modded game or if I'm running hardcore. If I'm doing regular or I'm just goofing off in a silly little mod, I'm not usually going to go for this, right? But that's, again, going to be a matter of your personal preference. They are nice, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that the Black Blood is bad, I'm just saying it's not necessarily effective enough where I want it every single time, right? It's going to depend on the situation. But we do still want the rest of Yugol, right? And you can see we need 20 green, 7 red, we need 2 more red, we need 10 more green. Now, we have easy green right off the top here. That sounded really weird, you know, outside of context, but we get the spider, of course. Everyone loves the spider. You get a bunch of really great stats. You've got some attributes, offensive ability, casting speed, attack speed. Just a lovely time. There's no reason to not get the spider. It's just a really great constellation to go for. But now we have to be a bit careful because we now have some options. We have some choices. And what those choices will entail is going to be very much according to what weapon you want to use. For example, if you want to go with a ranged weapon, you're going to be looking at the Hydra here, which is going to take 3 purple, right? You could go for the Wraith, right? You could absolutely do that. You've got lightning and aether damage, right? I'm not sure why you would, but it's an easy 3 purple, right? In theory, you're not going to get much benefit out of it, which is why I don't recommend this, but that's going to be something that's going to occur, right? Oh, 3 purple? Well, there's the Wraith there, right? Boom. But there are a couple of other options, as you can see here as well. If I'm going to go for that, I'm usually going to go for the Eye of the Guardian, which does give you acid and poison damage, although it does also give you some chaos damage increases, which really don't matter. We're not doing chaos damage, obviously. We get some chaos damage out of the Guardian's Gaze as well, but the big deal here is that poison damage. This is going to give us 3 purple, so if you want to go ranged, you absolutely can and probably should go for Eye of the Guardian, right? Great time, and then you can get the Hydra with your ranged. If you have a nice, and you can see where we have Yugol right here, but here's the kicker, so to speak. If you're starting with ranged, you get this far into it, and you change your weapon. Maybe you want to use melee, right? Well, you would have to if you're going from ranged to changing to not being able to use the Hydra. But anyway, say you want to go with melee, you now would have to pull all those points out of the Hydra. And if we're getting to the point where we're putting points into Yugol here, right, we now have to pull all the points out of Yugol. We have to pull all the points out of the Hydra, and that's a lot of points, right? This by itself here is 5 points out of Yugol. This right here is, of course, 6 points out of the Hydra. That's 11 points. That's 11 Aether Crystals you're using to pull points out, right? So, again, even with the Eye of, even with the Spider obviously you can keep long-term. Again, this is going to be generally useful across the board, but the Eye of the Guardian, you're only really specifically going to be looking at getting if you want that purple. Yeah, sure, it gives you some green, but you aren't going to want to go out of your way for this if you're not ranged and going for the Hydra, because there's better options, frankly, right? Of course, we also have, if you're using a two-handed weapon, you have access to the Kraken. Again, the main crux here is that if you're switching off of two-handed to go with dual wielding, for instance, you're going to want to drop the Kraken, and it only gives you 2 red. I mean, 2 red is something we need, but it is an option, right? But you would want to at least look at that. Now, what I am going to cover here are constellations that are safe picks every time, but I want you to at least, the reason why I'm talking about these is because I want you to see that there are specific constellations you'll want to go for once you lock in your build. When does that happen? I don't ever change my build once I hit level 95. At that point, it's like, this is what I'm rolling with. Maybe I get a better weapon, because again, a lot of these sort of improv builds rely very heavily on green items. So maybe I'll, if I'm going two-handed melee, I hit 95, I decide to stick with two-handed melee, I'm not changing that for anything, right? That's my personal standards. If you want to lock it in earlier, totally up to you. But once you decide you're locked in, then you want to go for some of these more specific constellations. But I wanted to talk about them first so you have them in your mind when we talk about the safe picks, so to speak. So for the last 2 points of red, I usually go for the ghoul, right? And there's a couple of reasons for this. And this is actually going to come back to a conversation that I had a lot. I spent a decent amount of time on talking about the Poison Cold build. Back when I was talking about the Poison Cold build in the previous episode, I discussed why I prefer Fighting Spirit over Markovian's Advantage. This is a really big reason why, right? If I need to, if I'm dual wielding, right, I'm going to be going for the ghoul. The ghoul is my two-hand melee, my dual wielding option, right? This is what I usually go to. I put Fighting Spirit here, okay? Yes, you can use Veil of Shadow here. If you're dual wielding, you can use Pneumatic Burst here. If you're if you're two-handed melee, you are using Menhir's Will or two-handed ranged as well. But if you're using two-handed, you're going for the Kraken for your red, not the Ghoulish Hunger, right? If you're using one-handed range, which I don't recommend for Cold Poison Blademaster, but if you are, you would want to put this on Veil of Shadow, of course. But yeah, Menhir's Will doesn't really apply here because you're going for the Kraken in that context. For dual wielding, you could put it on Pneumatic Burst, but I personally like to put it on Fighting Spirit because this trigger is guaranteed when you drop it to 45% health, and since Fighting Spirit has a potential to trigger every time you're... Fighting Spirit has a chance to trigger every time you're hit. This means that as you're getting attacked, Ghoulish Hunger will automatically trigger, Fighting Spirit will kick in, you're already getting 80% of your attack damage converted to health, and you crank all these points into Fighting Spirit, you're getting plus 200% of all damage, right? That's going to convert into more health returned for Ghoulish Hunger, which is why I really like to put that on specifically Fighting Spirit. I can just slap it on Fighting Spirit. I don't need to think about it. I don't need to worry about it. Pneumatic Burst. If Pneumatic Burst isn't active, which it remains active a few seconds after you initially use it because it's increasing your attack and move speed, if you forget to trigger that, then Ghoulish Hunger can't trigger because it's not active, so to speak, right? Besides the fact, if Fighting Spirit triggers, then you're getting that, again, increased damage. Yes, Fighting Spirit can trigger separately from Pneumatic Burst, of course, but I just like to have the two tied together because even if Fighting Spirit doesn't trigger at the same time as Ghoulish Hunger, a lot of the times it's going to trigger pretty damn quick afterwards, right? And I just really like that timing there, alright? But I can't... The big point here, the main point, is that I can't attach Ghoulish Hunger to Markovian's Advantage, so I have one fewer option to put Ghoulish Hunger on, right? Because Markovian's Advantage would emulate the benefits of Fighting Spirit pretty nicely, but you can't assign it to that, right? So that's why, yet another reason why I prefer Fighting Spirit over Markovian's Advantage in a Cold Poison Blademaster setup. Alright, now, where do we get the last green from? Well, you can go with the Behemoth. Now, you'll notice that there is red here, right? We'll talk about that. There is red here, but this is just a whole bunch of health, right? Health regeneration, health regeneration, armor and health, healing effects, health regeneration, Giant's Blood, right? Again, you can put Fighting Spirit here if you want. I typically put Pneumatic Burst on here, right? Because, again, you're looking at 15% chance when hit. Again, you can do this with Fighting Spirit as well. I just like the Pneumatic Burst because I'm going to be activating Pneumatic Burst whenever I've taken damage, and that's when I'm also going to need Giant's Blood. So, when my health gets dangerously low, it sometimes kind of acts as like a second Pneumatic Burst. It's very interesting. But, right, and now we can, of course, put in a single point of green here if you really want to, or you could go for another constellation. We'll talk about that, and we can get our hands on Yugol, right? And you'll notice we have a lot of points. we have a lot to work with here. A lot of points going on here. I know some people like to go a little bit spicy. They go with the Abomination here. They go up the middle. And which one's the poison arm? Not that one. This one's the poison arm. And they like to go down here for the poison damage of Tainted Eruption. Right? You can do that. It's totally up to you. I don't necessarily do that, but it is an option. I'm really fond of getting the Manticore. Right? And this is usually what I'll get instead of putting the 1 point into the crossroads up here. You can see we have plenty of points. This is fairly useful across the board. Again, we have all of these fantastic potential options here, right? You'll notice we actually can attach this to Markovian's Advantage, right? You have that option. This is really nice, though. Generally speaking, if I'm going for the Manticore, right, I'm not necessarily going for something else. We'll actually pull out the Ghoul here for a really quick second. I'm really fond of the Ghoul for dual wielding, though. And you can absolutely, if you want to, go Markovian's Advantage. If you want to go Markovian's Advantage, drop the Ghoul, go for the Manticore outright, go for the Behemoth, right? But again, we have some other options here. You can go for the Harpy, right? And there is, of course, the interesting possibility of, if you want to go for the Hydra, you can actually go for the Harpy by going Manticore, and then you go for the Harpy. And then, instead of the Behemoth, you can go for the Hydra. Again, if you change out of ranged weapons, you're going to need to change that, right? It's just something you're going to have to change. But you can do that as well. Okay? So you do have those options. It's actually... Anyways... So you do have those options, right? Again, you could also go for my favorite of the Owl. Another great option. Interestingly enough, by the way, if you are going with the ranged option, the Harpy is really great because it increases pierce damage, and like 98% of the guns, if not all of them, and crossbows as well, do 100% pierce damage. Even if you're not specifically looking to do pierce damage, it does enhance your weapon attacks a little bit, so it is nice to have, right? And of course, you're increasing your cold damage there. So this is just a really generally nice thing to have in the build. And then, of course, you have 4 points to mess around with it however you please. You could absolutely go for Ghoulish Hunger here, leaving off the foot. You could go for the Mantis if you're, again, using ranged. You can get a little more pierce out of that, right? You could go for some points on the Vulture if you really want to. You get some more life leech resistance there, which is really nice, right? Some vitality resistance if you want that. Or you can get an increase in Cunning and Spirit. Totally up to you. That is, absolutely an option. You could grab the whole Lizard for some extra healing, right? Because you have, regardless of which build you go for, you've got Pneumatic Burst or Menhir's Will, depending on whether or not you're using a two-handed weapon. Go for the Lizard. Either way, you're using a healing something, right? You have a lot of options, but you do have to be careful. Again, if you're going to go for the Kraken or if you're going to go for the Hydra, you're going to need to be 100% confident that you're going to stick with that weapon type and run with that the rest of the time, right? Just flat out. And of course, we still have, let's go on ahead and grab the Lizard and just put the last point into the, I already have, no, I didn't, I was going to say, I didn't think I'd put a point here. So you can absolutely do that, right? You have a lot of options. I just wanted a moment of caution for the Hydra, for the Kraken. Behemoth is a great option. I really like the Ghoul. I am going to go for the Ghoul if I'm dual wielding, very specifically, right? Great time. If I'm not, I'm going to go for the Manticore and the Behemoth combination, right? That's just going to absolutely work wonders. So we have all of those options, right? We have all those options with the cold poison. So let's talk about the physical, right? Now, again, with the physical, remember that I talked about 3 different damage types because I say the physical, it's really technically bleed vitality, as I discussed in the previous episode, but again, vitality is locked, unfortunately, behind Ratosh, who also does Aether damage, and that's a lot of points to devote to Ratosh, who is giving you some Aether damage that you aren't really going to use a lot of. But we do have easy access to bleed right here, and we have even easier access to pierce right here as well. Alright, so first off, obviously we're going to grab the Assassin's Blade for that pierce early game. We're going to have some obvious potential for physical damage as well. Now remember, with the Vitality build that I talked a decent amount about Phantasmal Blades. This is usually what I assign this to, right? You get a whole bunch of them. You can throw these ahead of time and potentially get an Assassin's Mark on an enemy before they even get to melee. It's a really great combination. But now what do we do? Because interestingly enough, we have a couple of interesting options for finalized constellations, right? We obviously want to be getting to the Huntress here. It's going to take 4 purple, 4 green, 3 red. But we also are going to want the Unknown Soldier, who is going to give us a combination of bleed and pierce damage. So the Unknown Soldier is absolutely great here, and he's purple and yellow. So you can see where we're basically going for 4 different colors here to some extent, and this can get a bit messy unless you approach it correctly, because there's some fun things we can do here. First off, we can grab the Falcon. That's going to be physical and bleed. We're primarily here for the bleeding, but we also get some green and some purple out of this, which is a great thing for us, because we can work towards some of the Unknown Soldier. You can see where we have all of the purple we need. We only need 1 more green, and we can actually get some yellow and green out of the Lotus here, which is a little bit overkill, I'll admit, but this is going to increase our energy regeneration, our healing effects. It's going to increase our health and energy. It's going to give us a little vitality resistance. It's a really great time, and we need a decent amount of yellow here. We need 8 yellow. We already have 5 at this point, and we've got 6 green, right? So now we have all the green we need. Now we need some red, right? And we have a couple of different options for red, but I really like to go with the Night Talon here, because we're going to get some cunning, elemental resistance. We get increased bleed duration, and then we get extra bleeding damage, right? Now you're going to notice we're 1 shy. I usually just slap the single point into the crossroads. Again, as I've mentioned in previous videos, I don't mind the yellow and red crossroads points, because that 5% health is going to scale with you to the end of the game, obviously, because it is a percentage increase. So that's just going to be really nice in general, and then we can get our hands on the Huntress, of course, right, which is just a lovely time. Now, fun fact about the Huntress, she provides a green, right? So if you really don't want the Lotus, you can just slap the single point in the green crossroads, grab the Huntress, and then undo the point in crossroads. I usually keep the Lotus because it is giving me some benefits that I really enjoy, right? I mean, we have the, again, I recommend usually going with, for the Phantasmal Blades, I usually recommend Frenetic Throw, right, because we have that vitality damage that we're getting out of, or increasing that vitality damage. You can keep the Pierce if you want, but if you are going to go with Frenetic Throw, then the increased energy regeneration on the Lotus is going to be really helpful, because you can spam them longer, right? If you don't plan on using Frenetic Throw, if you want to keep the Pierce damage, that's a non-factor, obviously, although, quite frankly, I still use it even then, because I rely on those very heavily in the early game, and they're very energy intensive in the early game, right? So I still stick with the Lotus. You don't have to. Again, if you want to go for the single point and you want to grab the Huntress and then undo that point, you absolutely can. For this specifically, again, I usually put Ring of Steel on this, because we still have Ring of Steel here. Obviously, it's not Ring of Frost, but of course, we have that delightful Pierce damage. We've got that, Pierce Bleed here. Great time. We have the lovely Rend, right? Now at this point, we want the Unknown Soldier. We need some more yellow. We need a lot more purple, right? For the purple, again, as you probably can guess, the Owl. Boom. Great. We get an increase in our bleed duration here. We get an increase to all of our damage here. It's a lovely time. The yellow is going to come down to more your personal preference. You have 2 options. You can go with the Lion for a quick 3-point increase, right? You get some spirit and health, movement speed, health, and an increase to all your damage, which is great. Or, if you're playing hardcore, it might be worthwhile getting the Dryad, right? Because she's going to give you health increases, she's going to give you reduced spirit requirements for your equipment, which means you can put a few more points into physique to help you stay alive. She gives you the lovely Dryad's Blessing, which is going to help keep you, not bleeding or poisoning to death. In hardcore, I'm going to go for the Dryad's Blessing. Specifically hardcore. I've never really found the Dryad to be too useful, even in modded situations. There is a theoretic argument that in mods that increase enemy group numbers, that Dryad's Blessing could be helpful there, but I've personally found that once the bleeding duration ended, because it's over a third shorter, right afterwards, I just get poisoned again. It doesn't really make a difference outside of hardcore, Alright, hardcore is the only place I found Dryad's Blessing to be a really big difference. In regular, obviously, it makes the same difference, but then dying isn't as consequential there. I mean, you still shouldn't be dying all over the place, obviously, but, you know, if you die, it's not the end of the character, which it would be in hardcore. So this is something I only really specifically throw the points into for hardcore, because it is two more points on that. So I usually go for the lion because the stat benefits we do get out of this are really nice. And then, of course, we get the unknown soldier. And again, if you really don't want the living shadow, you don't have to. I get this usually in hardcore. I get this in a lot of modded games. The living shadows are really useful in pretty much every mod that challenges you. Increased stat numbers? Well, extra bleeding damage. You get some healing out of this from the attack damage converted to health, right? It's a lovely time. Hardcore, attack damage converted to health. Increased enemy numbers. Living shadows will help, punch through those numbers and heal you as well. So living shadow is something I get for hardcore or mods. Base game, I don't really get it that often. I might briefly splash this in if I'm, say, having a bit of a hard time with a boss, because as you've probably guessed from the way that these skills are set up, unlike the cold poison, which can do really high amounts of damage to a single target, you'll notice that the vitality bleed is a little bit more, as I mentioned in the previous video, specialized in group handling. So sometimes if I'm having a hard time with a boss, maybe I haven't been lucky with my equipment, I'll sometimes temporarily throw a point into Living Shadow and run with that, right? So that's going to depend on situation. You can run this. It is very effective in a lot of situations, especially hardcore and modded situations, but you don't necessarily need this to succeed, right? So now we have 15 points kicking around. What else can we do with these? Well, you've got some options. You could go into Olorun if you really wanted to. You could grab an extra 5 points. You could, for example, go the really easy route with the Harpy because it's going to give you increased pierce damage. You could also alternatively go into the Fox as well, just on this side for some bleeding damage. You could actually theoretically do both of these if you really wanted to, but Olorun does give you some interesting increases in stats here. Again, if you really want Blind Fury, you can. Boom, right? And then you still have enough points for the Fox afterwards. You can even actually finish out to Blind Fury or Living Shadows and go for the Fox afterwards. I don't normally do this because that's 4 damage types, and while yes, you are reducing enemies' physical resistance as well, remember that enemies from Veteran onwards, past Veteran, on Elite and Legendary, I might be using the Titan Quest version because I've been playing that recently, but on Elite and Legendary difficulties, you're going to see a baseline increase in physical resistance. So I'm not hugely fond of grabbing Olorun. I also don't like the fact that the Harpy, literally half the Harpy's point here is cold damage, right? Yeah, you get some, there's a mild preference for Pierce, which isn't bad, but, I usually do pick up the Fox because that is going to be some bleeding damage, which we really like to see. Right? You could, if you really wanted to, go with the Wolf here, because this is also some bleeding damage, right? And some other effects as well. This is actually something I personally recommend you go for instead of Olorun, right? You're actually seeing some health increases here, right? Extra bleeding damage here. You've got some nice stats here. Health, vitality, resistance, defensive ability. Extra bleeding damage. Increase in healing effects. Increased duration. You've got yourself some resistances here. And then finally, if you really want to, you can go for the Howl of Mogdragon, right? Which, for me, I usually put, interestingly enough, this might confuse you, but I usually will either put this on Blade Trap or, more likely, I'll put this very specifically on Blade Arc. Very nice on Blade Arc. I've tried it with Blade Trap. It can be effective on Blade Trap, but Blade Arc is just a lot more consistent for fairly obvious reasons, right? If you really want to, another interesting idea you can do, and I've found a lot of success with this as well, if you don't want to put this to Blade Arc because you want to use the Howl of Mogdragon more efficiently on bosses, you can absolutely run Phantasmal Blades with that, and then switch your Assassin's Mark to Blade Arc, and then when you hit people with Blade Arc, if you've gotten the point in Clean Sweep, then when you hit them with Blade Arc, they fall over. If they have the Assassin's Mark, you are very, very likely to kill them before they can get back up, even if they don't glitch and lay on the floor for 12 years. Alright, so that is something I've found also to be very, very effective. And if you want to run it this way, you absolutely should. It's absolutely fantastic. But early on in the game, before you get Blade Arc, obviously you want Phantasmal Blades to have Assassin's Mark, because Assassin's Mark is important and the first thing you get. And it's the first thing you get because it's cheap, and again, it is extremely important. And your first skill is usually going to be Phantasmal Blades, right? If you follow along with me, you could go Blade Arc first and just run Blade Arc. Absolutely a possibility, right? But Blade Arc, you know, third stage here. This is second stage, so Phantasmal Blades is a little bit quicker to get to, which is why I recommend getting Phantasmal Blades first. Also, if you want to emphasize the vitality damage over the piercing damage, you can set up Frenetic Throw, and that's going to be also very useful for you. So I recommend you start with Phantasmal Blades. If you want to make the switch later, totally fine, but Phantasmal Blades, attach Assassin's Mark to it, run with Blade Arc afterwards when you're ready to, right? That's usually where I go with that, right? Now, where you want to put your last 5 points, totally up to you. You could put them into Affliction if you want some Vitality Decay and Vitality damage. Totally an option here, right? You get some acid damage out of this, right? You can grab Fetid Pool for some Vitality damage. It's an option, right? Actually, it's not even a bad idea to necessarily go for, like, the first... Oh, it starts from the back here, right? Grab this and just run with this. I don't get this very often because I'm not a huge fan of Affliction. You absolutely could do that, though. As you can see, you can go over here and get the Hydra if you're going with ranged. Right, you have all these options. You could even, if you're going with, you know, swords. No, the swords are this one. If you're going with melee, you can go for the Assassin, which gives you pierce damage, of course. Right, this gives you Blades of Wrath, which we love to see. You can actually just work your way totally up to here without even having to necessarily bother with this or this, because neither of these are necessarily needed, right? 8% increased damage to humans, optional. There's not that many human enemies in the game, actually. This is a flat increase in offensive and defensive ability. Nice to have, but not necessary. All the important parts of the Assassin are the mainstream here. You've got the pierce damage here. You've got the cunning increase here to increase your, of course, weapon damage. Pierce damage here. And you have the Blades of Wrath for more pierce damage. So the important part of the Assassin is right up that line. I often go with this. Okay, this is my usual go-to. And a lot of the times when I am running this specifically, this is going to be Blade Trap a lot of the times, because these are... they expand outwards from you, so this is more of a group thing anyways, and you're going to be using Blade Trap more often on group enemies, because they're actually going to get stuck in it. Bosses and heroes aren't usually going to get stuck in it. There's a couple of exceptions, but not really. But this is absolutely... you know, I find that very, very effective, personally. But this is usually how I set this up kind of specifically. But again, you've got a lot of options. If you want Olorun, you absolutely can run Olorun. It is not as effective as Mogdragon is, but you can do that, right? You could go for the Spider if you want those stats as well instead of the Assassin. Again, totally up to you. You could go all the way over here for the Mantis if you want that, because that's also going to be pierce damage. Another option, right? You have all these options. But again, you want to be a little bit careful. I mentioned the Hydra earlier because he is going to be an option you have access to. Again, you're going to want to be careful with that because that is ranged only, right? So just keep that in mind, right? This one is less sensitive, obviously, though, because you'll see that none of these really... and you'll actually notice I didn't bring in Blades of Nidan because this does require a sword, which you might not necessarily be using. Besides the fact that it's very expensive to get to. Which is also why I like the Assassin. You can, with these constellations, you can change your weapon freely and not have to worry about it again unless you go for the Hydra. So we do have, of course, that as well. Now, the physical version, I'm actually not going to undo this completely because the physical version runs pretty similarly. Right? The only real difference between the... constellation-wise, between the Vitality Bleed and the Physical Pierce is that you don't go for Mogdragon and you don't go for the Huntress, right? Actually, I think I probably will undo this because it's going to be just a little faster that way. And this is just going to follow a lot of the same precepts as the baseline soldier, which you probably saw coming if you've seen the previous videos, right? You're going physical, you're going pierce, right? You're going for the internal trauma. Obviously, you're going to have cadence. You're going to want to attach Assassin's Mark to cadence a lot of the time. You could also use attach it to Force Wave if you're using that as well. Go for the hammer, of course. You're going to want to be looking, obviously, for the Unknown Soldier, for his Raka, for Olrun. You've got all these great options, right? Going to want to go for those. I'm actually going to cut this one short because this is literally... Well, no, I won't do that. That's kind of a cop-out. We just go on ahead and go through, grab the Falcon because of that bleed damage, which we absolutely can use very effectively, right? We go on ahead and we grab the Stag for physical bleed as well, right? We can grab the Bull, because we don't need a ton of yellow here, but we do need some blue for his Raka, because she is going to give us very specifically that physical pierce. So his Raka is going to be that first one you're going for in a lot of these situations. I've mentioned bleed here a couple of times. I have the Falcon, for instance. The reason why is because you do have some easy access to bleed. If you are going with the soldier, again, keep in mind that Olrun's Rage increases physical pierce and internal trauma damage. I have all these skills in here for the constellations, but if you want to run, say, Ring of Steel, pierce damage, then bleed damage, right? If you've got Blade Arc, which has, as I discussed in the previous episode, bleed damage, internal trauma, and physical, and bleed damage, right? It's very easy to splash some bleed in here. I'm not necessarily going for the Huntress because I don't necessarily care about reducing their resistances to it, but you also will notice that I could very easily slide that in if I really wanted to. This is very flexible, the physical version, and the reason why this is really flexible compared to the previous two is because you are leaning more heavily on the soldier, which has fewer requirements than the Nightblade really technically does. Right, there's fewer skills that really heavily depend on the existence of specific items, theoretically, right? Force Wave, you need a shield or a two-handed weapon. Blitz, two-handed melee weapon. For Nightblade, theoretically it's just the dual wielding. That has, obviously, the dual wielding requirement, but Pneumatic Burst, in this specific context, is going to be looking more at the dual wielding, because if you aren't dual wielding, then Menhir's Will is going to be more effective for you a lot of the times, right? So, technically, it's a lot easier. And again, I don't necessarily always use Blitz for damage. Sometimes this is just grab it for the single movement speed. And technically, even if you're dual wielding, you can Blitz, obviously, right? It requires a melee weapon. It doesn't have to be two-handed. Obviously, it's more effective with two-handed, but you can use Blitz without, right? I just associate it with two-hand melee because that's just always when I use it. So we could, of course, go with Targo the Builder here. This is more along the lines if you're using shield. Again, if you're starting with a shield, you grab Targo and then you change your mind. This is going to be reversal, and he only gives you one yellow, so I don't normally go for this, but it's worth a brief mention there because I know if I don't mention it, somebody will ask, which is absolutely what they should do. We, of course, still need some blue, right? You could absolutely go for the Scarab. Again, that's more along the lines of shield. Not quite cripplingly so, right? Again, I usually like to go for the Lizard. And then we have access to Azraka at this point, so we just go ahead and grab her. Again, if you go for Shifting Sands, it's totally up to you. I actually really like Shifting Sands, mostly because it does scale with you, unlike some of these other ones that I've talked about this episode so far. Go ahead and grab that. That's personal preference, of course. If I am going to be using Shifting Sands, a lot of the times, I really do like to attach this to Cadence, right? This, of course, again, I mentioned Force Wave. This is where I'll switch that to Force Wave if I haven't already. And now, at this point, if you want the Unknown Soldier, you just need another point in yellow, which you can very easily get from the Lion, right? If you want Olrun, this is just a quick grab into some more purple. The easy way is the Harpy, but if you wanted to go the longer way, you could get Olzad, right? We have physical damage there, right? We've got, of course, physical and internal trauma damage here. We've got Olzad's Decree, right? We go on ahead and grab this really quick, and lo and behold, we only need 3 more purple. We can go into the Harvestman's Scythe, which also, by the way, can functionally work as well. If you want to use the Harvestman's Scythe instead of the Lizard, you absolutely can, of course, right? You'll see we still have the blue we need. Totally an option, right? If I'm going for Olorun, I'm obviously going to go for this instead. If I'm going for the Unknown Soldier, it's just easier getting the Lizard, passing right over the Harvestman's Scythe, because if you have Azraka, you're not that far away from getting the Unknown Soldier anyways. So, well, yes, you could use the Harvestman's Scythe here. You could also just easily go for Olzad, right? Of course. Because if we didn't have the Harvestman's Scythe here, we would have 17 purple, which would be more than enough for the Unknown Soldier, of course, right? So you do have that. Free up 3 extra points. You could just go for the Lion, right? Boom. No issues. You could also, additionally, if you really wanted to, throw some points into the Boar here, right? You get some retaliation damage if you're using a shield. It's a great shield option. Again, if you switch out of the shield, you have to readjust that pretty aggressively. And again, for this combination, because there are so many dependent skills here, skills dependent upon what you're equipped with, that is going to be even more expensive, right? But you do, again, this is following a very similar trail to what I talked about in all of the other pure physical builds. They all roughly follow the same pattern. Again, we really prioritize Azraka just as we did with the solo soldier, right? Same exact approach. Same exact approach. By the way, I haven't talked about what I put Olzad's Decree on or the Falcons, because this really depends on what I actually have. Do I have Warcry? Makes a great option for specifically Olzad's Decree, right? Because this is very much increasing your damage, right? This is increasing your armor. So in this particular context, you know, if I'm having a hard time, I'm using Warcry, it's because I'm probably having an issue and I need the armor increase, right? For the Falcon Swoop, you know, if I'm using Blade Arc, I'll put it on that. If I'm using Blitz, I'll put it on that. Even if I have the 1 point in Blitz, it can be very effective there. If I'm using Ring of Steel, I'll use it on that. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, quite a few Nightblade, and even in the previous episode, quite a few of these skills can be very useful in a physical Pierce context, right? You could even use Phantasmal Blades, this first section here, very easily with a physical build. I wouldn't necessarily go all the way to Heartseeker, but I could recommend regular Phantasmal Blades. You've got Blade Trap doing piercing damage, right? You've got some piercing options here, as I mentioned in the previous episode. So if you want to, you can very easily, again, like I said before, you can splash very easily into some bleed if you wanted to. You could absolutely adjust this to run a sort of bleed build. You could actually, for Pete's sakes, if you really wanted to, you could run the same constellations I just talked about with the bleed vitality, but use a physical pierce build, right? And splash in some bleed. You can absolutely do that, right? You can use the bleed damage to kind of compensate for the fact that pretty much everything larger than you is going to have an additional baseline 15-ish% physical resistance increase, right? Absolutely an option. Run the 3 damage. Just the emphasis is on the pierce and physical rather than on some vitality and bleed, right? That's the only real difference. There, again, very, very flexible here. You're sort of ending constellations. You are going to want to be a bit careful with where you go with that. Again, the Hydra is a great option for these if you're using the ranged. The Kraken is a great option for the cold poison if you're using the 2-hand weapon, whether it be melee or ranged. But you have to be very careful because you can see where, and again, I've talked about this with a physical build where you have a lot of opportunities for a shield, but if you decide to use a physical dual wielding, you're gonna have to pull out Targo if you used him. You're gonna have to pull out the Boar that I just talked about if you use him, because that's a retaliation, and you have more of that with the shield, of course. Right? If you want to use the Anvil for its 5 purple instead of the Owl, this is defensive ability. This is armor absorption. This requires you to be able to block. Targo's hammer requires a shield to be used. If you switch out of a shield, you have to switch out of the anvil, because it's not going to be effective. You're not going to be able to block without a shield, and you're not going to be able to use Targo's hammer, so you would have to pull the points out of this, which means if you used this instead of the owl, you would have to backtrack absolutely everyone, right, up to Azraka, right? We grabbed Azraka here, pretend this isn't here, right, and this isn't here. We're back down to the 15 purple, right? Then you would have, the anvil instead of the owl, and you would have to at least pull out Azraka, minimum, which is, again, 6 points here, 5 if you didn't put the final point in, and 5 points here, that's 10 points you would have to reverse. And again, if you're running a fresh character, you're not necessarily always going to have that, so you have to be very careful with your early constellations, which is why I've constructed them in these specific ways, right? These are just the constellations that are the safest to get, where you can flex around with your build if you really want to, but I have made sure to talk about some constellations that are really useful for specific weapons, but you just have to be unusually careful with these constellations with the Blademaster because of the context. Again, with the previously discussed classes up to this point, you didn't need to be as cautious, right? Because what weapon you used for most of those builds really didn't matter. There were some setups that worked a little bit better. I talked about a retaliation build with the Witchblade. That works a little better with the shield, but you can play it without, obviously, right? You can do a two-hand melee retaliation build with that, and it would work just as well. And those constellations were a lot easier to adjust. I think there was only one constellation, the Scarab, if I remember off the top of my head, was the only one that you would potentially want to change. But with the Blademaster, because you've got basically this choice between either dual wielding or two-handing or shield, you've technically got a three-way choice, you have to approach the constellations with a bit more caution, just like you have to approach your skills with a bit more caution, right? You get your baselines that you need down, set up, and where you want them, and then you start specializing, because otherwise you're going to have to do a lot of reversal, right? So with that being said, thank you very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.